Hey everyone, welcome to Redefining HR podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I am joined by Pavle Stojkovic. Pavle is the Chief People Officer at Sword Health, and we're going to talk about his career in hyperscale and growth, what he's doing now, what it was like to move into his new role during this crazy market for HR leaders right now, and a lot more. So Pavle, thanks so much for coming on the show. I'd love to have you open with an introduction for the audience.
Lars, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here. Yeah, so I'm Pavle Stojkovic, Chief People Officer at Sword Health. Background in HR, but more fundamentally, I think of myself as a builder. Kind of made a career by getting myself into chaos and turning chaos into order. So really enjoy building, really enjoy working with people and scaling teams.
Yes, you've had a few build runs under your belt already, but I want to actually start at the beginning. So, I know you've shared that your parents immigrated to the U.S. When you were two from Yugoslavia to kind of move away from the conflict there and start a new life for you. And I want to, going through something like that, even at a young age, I imagine has a huge impact on how you view work, how you view life. Like, how did that experience, I didn't even say how does that experience and kind of that upbringing shape who you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, fortune favors the bold, right? What I learned from my parents is that, you know, yes, they were moving away from something, but I think the real lesson, especially as I grew up, was what they were kind of moving towards, right? They saw the potential for a better life, for a better opportunity, and they knew that the only way to get it was to take a leap of faith, take this big risk, and trust in their own ability to kind of figure it out as they went along, right? Growing up, my parents did a really good job of making me feel like, we had a normal upbringing, that I had a normal upbringing. And that's just kind of like a testament to their hard work. And as I grew up and as I learned to appreciate a lot of that, and what they had done for me and for our family, it really just kind of allowed me to lean in, right? To take bigger risks, to recognize that if you really want to get to where you want to go, you have to be out of your comfort zone. You have to be willing to take those risks and trust that you're going to overcome them and figure it out as you go.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think as in your introduction, you kind of framed yourself as a builder, and I can see the through line, to that in terms of looking for opportunities, willing to take risks, which is the DNA that isn't necessarily always common in HR historically, but I think these days we're seeing a lot more of that, and we're better for it. So you grew up in Florida, you went to school at University of Florida. I won't hold that against you, as we had our own jokes before this as a FSU grad. So we'll keep it friendly here. But your first role was in HR at Groove Shark, and so
Yeah.
what originally compelled you to HR? Why was that a field? Like, did you know you were going to get into that when you were graduating? Is it something you just kind of happened into? Like, what was the background there?
Yeah, so I did not plan to get into HR. Very much kind of stumbled into it organically. So Groove Shark was this meteoric rise and just as meteoric of a fall. Pre Spotify, the music industry was still kind of trying to figure itself out, and I got involved with this company pretty early on in their hyper growth. Originally kind of just, I wanted to be in the mix, right? I recognized that there was something interesting going on here, and I just wanted to be involved. So I actually kind of started in an ad sales role. Recognized I was pretty good at it. Had some early wins, and the company was trying to grow. They were trying to bring people in. So I approached one of the co-founders, who's actually a good friend of mine, and I told him, "Hey, look, like I think that I want to give this recruiting thing a shot." And he said, "We need it. Go for it." And I recognized pretty quickly that I was good at it. It felt similar to sales, but I found it more rewarding, bringing people in, giving people opportunities. And then, as the HR stuff kind of started to build around the company, they just kept saying, "Oh, well, Pavle should take it. He can do it." So I really just had 4 years of basically a sandbox experience. And then the way I can really describe my time at Groove Shark was just tons of failing, left and right. Had no idea what I was doing. Really just kind of tried to figure it out on the fly. started to look into the PHR, got some certifications, started reading books, and really just, I really, looking back on it, defining those first 4 years of just learning by failing, which turns out is a fantastic way to learn.
Failure is a hell of a teacher. I mean, I think especially when you're in that environment, you're especially in startups, you're doing things for the first time. As
Yeah.
an individual, you're experiencing those things for the first time, and so you can look for inspiration on the outside. And I think now you can find a lot of inspiration. But then, we were probably a bit more black box than open source, so it was a little harder to come by that. So yeah, but that's those. The school of hard knocks, I think, can be a great
Yeah.
way to build your skills and
Yeah.
capabilities. So
Yeah. And I think the foundation, what it gave me was a foundation that's probably like a little bit different than traditional HR, right? It sounds cheesy to say, but I didn't know what the rules were, right? So I didn't know what kind of boxes I needed to be operating in. And I think that actually gave me a leg up in my career, because I wasn't shy about, trying things out. And like we talked about earlier, right? Taking risks and just kind of pushing the envelope in these areas, because I didn't really have anybody to tell me no, or that wasn't the way it was done. So very much kind of like created this foundation of just figuring things out and seeing what worked.
yeah, I mean, that can be a really freeing environment, actually, when you're able to just kind of build and learn from mistakes, and have an organization that understands that that's how you're approaching things, right? So you have that freedom to fail. I think is so important, especially in those formative kind of early years of your career. From there, you had a couple roles before you landed at the Athletic, and the Athletic, for those of you that don't know, was acquired by the New York Times last year. You led them through a pretty significant stage of growth. So walk me through that experience, right? You had beyond Groove Shark, you had a few more runs under your belt. You probably had a bit more of an idea. You were doing less things for the first times, perhaps,
Yeah.
but now you're in this kind of real scale environment. So what was that experience like for you?
Yeah. It was, I mean, it's a surreal experience, right? I think, one thing that I really enjoyed about my time at the Athletic was just really leaning into that hyper growth, right? And just kind of recognizing that, as much as you want to be able to plan really far ahead, it's you can really only see a few steps ahead, right? So it goes back to kind of that being able to trust yourself, trust the people that you're surrounded with, and then try and you want to build for the solutions that you of course need today, with having that eye for the future, right? How can I make sure that I'm thinking a little bit ahead, knowing that we plan to keep growing, we plan to keep expanding, and just kind of trying to anticipate as much of that work ahead of you as possible.
Yeah, so I'm sure you learned a lot during that period, and I'm sure you still experienced some things for the first time, kind of during that period. Pavle at the end, like right before the acquisition by New York Times, if you had a time machine, you had a chance to go back and talk to Pavle onboarding right before your experience of that. Like, what advice would you have given that may have kind of helped you even make more of an impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always kind of that thought in your head of, oh, I wish I would have started X or Y, sooner, right? When you're building companies, that's always something that you think about with the benefit of hindsight. Um, yeah, I talk a lot about this concept of cultural debt, right? What are mistakes that companies make early on that have a compounding effect, later on, when it's harder to steer the ship, when it's harder to make those turns, right? So, something that I've taken with me, is just kind of understanding that there are some really important things that you can do, infrastructure work really, that you can do early, that'll really pay dividends as the company starts to scale, right? So being more thoughtful about your hiring infrastructure and your talent acquisition process, being more thoughtful about things like your leveling and your leveling frameworks and your compensation philosophy. The earlier you can do that work at a company, the better off you will be as you start to scale. Because once you start adding hundreds of employees, you're onboarding 20, 30, 40 people a month. It's a lot more difficult to correct those mistakes, and those mistakes become a lot more expensive to fix, right? So the earlier that you can do that work, the better. And I think a lot of startups are cluing into that, right? You're seeing head of HR, VP of people type roles popping up earlier in a company's life cycle. And that's smart, right? Because companies and co-founders and leaders are realizing that the sooner they do that work, the better off they'll be. And even if it might feel a little early for where they are today, you're not solving for today, you're solving for where you want to be tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, and I think that is part of the reason why the market for HR leadership is on fire, right now, because it's a combination of companies investing in that role earlier, more companies realizing that they need those modern operators, right? Maybe who didn't weather the last couple of years as well because their function wasn't resourced in the way it needed to be to help the company be more agile and nimble around these circumstances, and on the other side also more experienced leaders who are stepping away from the role, whether to take time off, move into coaching. So it's kind of all those things combining to create a job market for HR leaders that we haven't seen before. And obviously, you don't need me to tell you that because you've experienced that, recently when after the acquisition by New York Times, you
Yep.
moved over to Sword Health. I want to talk about Sword Health, but before we even get there, what was that process like for you, kind of being an active candidate in this job market?
Yeah. I mean, it was pretty insane, right? There are a lot of first of all, it was a great position to be in, candidly,
Yeah.
right? I think there's a lot of great opportunities out there. And I think for the first time in my career, it was a real opportunity for me to kind of take a step back and say, okay, what direction do I actually want to take my career in? And it allowed me to really kind of think about what are the must-haves at the top of my list. And the things that I realized that I wanted to index for were, number one, the leaders that I'm going to surround myself with, and more specifically, low ego individuals that understand that a strong people function needs to be woven into the fabric of the company, right? So even more fundamental than the product or the service, it was the people that I would be surrounding myself with, and really how they think about this function within the context of their business. So that's what I was kind of solving for, right? So I was, I was thinking about the conversations I was having. I was thinking about how I was interacting with these CEOs that I was meeting, and that was number one on the list before anything else.
Yeah, I mean, was and of course, I don't know how many interviews you had before you landed on Sword, but looking back in the conversations that you had with companies, does anything stand outside of Sword Health, or maybe even including Sword Health? Does
Yeah.
anything stand out to you in terms of what companies did in engineering their interview process, either good or bad? That maybe wisdom you can share from your own
Yeah.
experience, so that others who are watching and kind of designing these, either you're hiring a CPO or you're designing these processes, things to be mindful of.
Yeah. So I think, maybe this is tough to spot, but certainly from experience, right? Um, there are, based on the conversations that I was having, I feel like you can generally put CEOs into two buckets: those that actually understand the power of the people function, and those that recognize that it's important, or someone is telling them that it's important, but they don't quite understand it themselves, right? And it's a very fine line there, and kind of recognizing that difference. But that's really what I would urge people to be thinking about is, don't be shy about digging in with founders that you're speaking to, or CEOs that you're meeting with, and try and get them to explain to you why this function is important to them. And that's really kind of how I approach the process, right? You want to try and find companies that really value the function, because it means that you can actually do your best work in that organization. If you're joining an organization that doesn't quite get the value, you're only going to be like 50-60% as successful as you can be, right? Because you're always going to be kind of sidelined into the support role, rather than somebody that's an integral thought partner, at the top of the organization. So it's tough to spot the difference, but that's really kind of what you need to be looking for, in my opinion.
Yeah. And so, what was it about Sword Health that drew you to the opportunities? Sounds like you had a range of things that you were exploring and considering. What made Sword Health stand out to you?
Yeah. So a lot of things, right? I think, first and foremost, it goes back to what I was speaking to, right? Which was, as I started to meet the leaders that were already in the organization, I got the sense that, these were people that were doing it for the right reasons, right? Wanting to help people, wanting to free people from physical pain. It's such a big, area. It's such a big category and such a large body of work that needs to be addressed. Roughly 1 in 2 people have some type of MSK related pain, right? That's huge. It's larger than the mental health space, right? And physical health has a big impact on mental health as well, right? So wanting to kind of get involved with a company where the people at the top care about other people and want to help people, right? And so that was a big area that drew me in. But then also what I was just talking about, right? Which is wanting to be part of an organization that truly values the people function, that sees it as not just something that's a support, but that really impacts how the organization can scale thoughtfully, right? It's about bringing the right people in. It's about keeping the right people at the organization. It's about creating opportunities for people to grow within the organization. These were things that I was seeing at Sword as I was having those conversations, and that's something that I wanted to be a part of, right? Part of an organization that really thinks about the entire employee life cycle holistically, and then create that type of environment where we're bringing in and retaining the best people that we possibly can.
And so for listeners and viewers that aren't familiar with Sword Health, you mentioned kind of, pain management. Can you go into a little more detail on kind of what the company does?
Yeah. So, in short, right, it's digital MSK, which is musculoskeletal. We basically, we have a digital physical therapist solution, which is a combination of sensors and interacting with a physical therapist to provide that therapy for people that are either suffering from pain or recovering from injuries, so on and so forth, right? So it's an opportunity for us to kind of remove a lot of the barriers that people have when they're going to get traditional physical therapy. We've moved that into the digital space.
Interesting. And what is the company size at this stage?
Yeah, so we are a little bit over 350 employees, roughly 50-50 split between the United States and Portugal. The company is actually Portuguese in origin, so we have about a 50-50 split between the two.
Okay. And so for you, like, I know you're probably by definition, you're a little bit past your, traditional onboarding stage, but not all that much. So like how, was there anything that you kind of designed or structured, or maybe that Sword designed or structured in your onboarding process that helped with your kind of acclimation into the business, into establishing relationships with your executive peers and your teams? Like what can listeners and viewers kind of learn from your onboarding experience?
Yeah. Well, Lars, when you're joining a hyper growth company like Sword, onboarding is like, a week tops, especially when you're the chief people officer, right? No, but jokes aside, I think, look, right, when you're the CPO and when it's your responsibility to really level up the entire organization from an HR perspective, the important thing that I need to do early on is to really start having as many of those conversations as I possibly can, right? Meet with other business unit leaders, understand how the organization is functioning today, and start thinking about where we need to be tomorrow, right? So as I started to build my team and started to scale my team, I'm not hiring for today's needs. I'm hiring for tomorrow's needs, right? So always thinking ahead, right? We were just talking about this with The Athletic, right? Kind of recognizing what are those things that you can address now that will pay dividends in the future, right? So, a lot of the early work for these first few months have really been understanding what kind of team we need to have in place, understanding what kind of infrastructure we either need to put in place or elevate what's already there today, to make sure that we're thinking about not just the 350 that we're at, but 600, 1,000, so on and so forth, right? You always want to make sure that you're planning ahead so that you can scale effectively. And fundamentally, the way I think about the people function, I describe it as decentralized HR. So, we do our best work when we empower everybody else to carry the ball for us. So, it's about building the tools, it's about providing the knowledge, the training, the expertise, and then, facilitating and supporting as needed, right? But one of the metrics that I always think about for my team is any two employees anywhere in the company should have the same experience, right? Whether that's onboarding or performance or compensation or whatever the case may be, right? We're trying to create a body of work that empowers everybody else to carry the ball for us. And that's really the type of infrastructure that we're building. And really just kind of having all those conversations as early as possible to understand what's the work that we need to do today to make that reality possible as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you describe that. When I was writing my book last year, one of the chapters was around like the whole book kind of explores the evolution of HR from old school HR to modern HR. And one of the biggest shifts to me was this move from these kind of command and control structures that we used to have to decentralize and empower, which is exactly kind of what you're describing. I think that when you look at modern operators, their role isn't to run and own and insert themselves into everything. It's to create the framework so that the people can do the work, leaders can lead, managers can manage. And so hearing you describe it that way definitely resonates. And I know you've written about your kind of personal view around the importance of combining kind of the human and people experience at work with data. And I'd love to kind of get a sense of what that means for you at Sword. Like, how do you think about leveraging data as you design your people strategy?
Yeah. So I think, look, like data is only half the picture, right? Especially when you're dealing with human beings, right? So you can't get all the information that you need from data alone. I think data is helpful when you're thinking about, the macro, how human beings are moving through the organization. That's where data is really helpful, right? But you also need to, combine it with that qualitative human experience to really understand not just, okay, what are we seeing happening at scale, but how do the people in the organization actually feel about the experiences that they're having, right? And it's really the combination of these two things that give you the complete picture, right? So, we always look at the way our systems operate, and that's where we look at the data. But then we always make sure that we're having conversations with our employees, at key moments throughout those steps on the employee journey and the employee life cycle, right? So maybe that's, some of the obvious ones are you complete onboarding. What was that experience like to you? Give us the kind of the qualitative feedback on what it felt like to go through this experience, how we made you feel. What's your perception of the company now that you've gone through this process? And other obvious kind of touch points around performance and so on and so forth. As we finish these cycles, how do people feel about them, right? And then just kind of ongoing conversations, right? As we go through, engagement survey cycles and things like that, really just making sure that we are also indexing for that qualitative feedback and not just looking at the numbers and the heat maps and so on and so forth. You need to always be looking at those two things because at the end of the day, it's not about necessarily what objective fact is. It's about perception, right? The way people perceive their relationship with the organization is critical, and you have to understand that. You have to always be thinking about that because as the company continues to grow, you want your employees to be your evangelists, right? Whether they're staying in the organization and growing with the organization for years to come, or if they move on to do something else, right? The way they remember the company, the way they feel about the company, it's a critical part of kind of creating an ecosystem outside of the organization, and how people think and feel about the company.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. And I'm glad you made that kind of distinction between kind of hard data and numbers and kind of objective truth as it relates to data and perceptions and how people feel about the organization. Because those two things aren't necessarily always aligned. And if you're making decisions purely based on the data without factoring in that, you're going to make some misses. And so, I appreciate you reinforcing that. One thing I'd love to get your thoughts on as well is, we're kind of in this really unique opportunity in the field where we're actually redefining work itself, right? As we continue to move through the pandemic, obviously we're still in it, but we're redesigning, we're kind of moving away from industrial era constructs of work that kind of dictate how, where, and when we work, and building something new. And I'd love to get your perspective. Like when you think about this moment in time for HR leaders and for you specifically, like what gets you most excited about this new world of work we're building?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, it's an opportunity for us to really treat each other like adults, and I think it's probably the simplest way I can put it. Right. So something that that I share with my team is it's not about the green dot on Slack. Right. It's about I'm not looking for you to be online all day every day between these hours. Right. Let's have mature conversations about what our expectations are for each other, for the roles that we're doing, and that's how we should be holding each other accountable, right? How we do that, on the day to day is irrelevant, right? Yes, we want to have sometimes set aside so that we can actually interact with each other for our meetings, core hours, things like that. But outside of that, treat each other like adults, give each other the flexibility to integrate our personal lives with our work lives, and then get things done through those expectations and accountability levers, rather than I'm at my desk from this hour to that hour, because that does not necessarily translate to doing good work, to being productive, or to being efficient, right? You're solving in that environment, you're solving for the kind of that visibility piece, and you're not actually doing your best work, right? So let's put that stuff aside, and let's actually create environments where people can do their best work rather than just look like they're working.
Yeah, I mean, you hear the kind of butts and seats analogy all the time as it relates to like that was our general measure of productivity,
Yeah.
which is kind of ridiculous because even if you see somebody, like you don't know what they're doing. Like we're bad at measuring output. We're especially as it relates to kind of that legacy lens of looking at visibility equals productivity. And so I think it'll be exciting as we continue to move through this, like how we get better about measuring output. Because if we can really truly shift towards that, it doesn't matter when you work to an extent. It doesn't matter where you work to an extent. It matters like what you produce and what you contribute, and the impact that you can have. And so if you can do that in less hours, you can do that from an island in the South Pacific. It doesn't really matter. So Pavle, I've really enjoyed learning about your career path, your recent transition in your search. So I appreciate you walking us through all of that. We wrap up every episode with a lightning round, just allow the audience to get to know you a little bit better. So you ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Okay, we kick things off with music. I'm checking out your Spotify playlist. Who am I going to learn are your top three artists?
Oh boy. So I'm all over the map. So, I mean, the Beatles are definitely on there. I would put probably Zeppelin at number two, and then Kendrick Lamar at number three. So those are probably the three big ones for me. Maybe the Beach
All
Boys are
right,
on there too, if I had to throw in a number four.
Beach. I was about to say I appreciate your age before you drop Beach Boys on me. Now I really appreciate your age. Let's shift over to the screen. So what was your latest binge on TV?
So I'm a huge sci-fi nerd. Love watching some sci-fi. Just watched all 7 seasons of Deep Space Nine. If you haven't seen it, aged very well. Big Star Trek fan.
Okay, I'll have to check that out. Next, we're going to reinvent you. You're moving away from HR. You can't work in this space anymore. What would you be doing?
Yeah. Look, love the outdoors, love to move my body. So if I could, if I had my way, I would probably be outside trail running or something. So I don't know, maybe tackling like some triathlons or some type of physical endurance, sports related stuff. So that's probably what I would do instead.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that's available to you. That can be
Sure.
can be in your future. So we may have to do a check in, next year and see when you get those triathlons under your belt. So, and I know you're in Southern California, so the weather is quite
Perfect for it.
accommodating. Last question for you, Pavle. Who is one HR leader who you admire and why?
Yeah, so I think somebody like a Kathleen Hogan comes to mind, and her predecessors at Microsoft. I mean, if you meet people at Microsoft, they've been at Microsoft forever, right? That seems to be the trend, and that's really commendable, right? So it's about creating this environment where people want to stay for decades in some cases, and I think that's admirable, and I think that's kind of the best outcome you can have for the work that we do.
Yeah, I mean, especially this day and age, when mobility is certainly on the rise, creating those sticky environments where people can really build a career and not just a role is pretty rare and exceptional. So, and Kathleen's
100%.
amazing. So,
Yeah.
well, Pavle, man, I really enjoyed the conversation with you. I appreciate you making time to share your journey and your wisdom and your career with all of us, and look forward to kind of continuing to follow what you're building.